This is the richest man who ever lived. His name was Augustus Caesar. He was the nephew and heir of the famous Julius Caesar, the Roman emperor. And he was the wealthiest man in history, period. But just how much money did this guy have? Well, his estimated net worth adjusted for inflation is $4.6 trillion. Yes, trillion. You heard that right. And if that amount doesn't blow your mind enough, wait till you hear this. Some people say that the man who comes after him on the list of the richest people ever, the king of Timbuktu, Mansa Musa, his wealth was so great that it couldn't even be counted. So how can we possibly compare these two guys? How did Augustus manage to acquire such a staggering sum of money? And how did he lose it? And what about Mansa's wealth? If it was so great that it couldn't be counted, then why do some sources claim he's the richest person in history? We'll answer all of these questions and more today. So let's start. It is generally believed that Augustus was born into the new year of 63 BC. His birth name was Gaius Octavius, but later he was adopted by his great-uncle, Julius Caesar, and changed his name to his own. You see, Caesar didn't have any sons, but he did have a nephew named Octavian, who was the son of his sister Julia, and so he decided to make him his heir and adopted him. When Caesar was assassinated on March the 15th, 44 BC, young Octavius was only 19 years old, but that didn't stop him from taking his revenge. Yes, he took his great-uncle's killers to court and made sure they were punished. 2 of them even committed suicide, while others were exiled from Rome. Of course, that wasn't the only thing that Octavius inherited from his great-uncle. He also got his uncle's fortune, which was so huge that it's hard to imagine. Historians agree that Julius Caesar was immensely wealthy, but they differ in their assessment of his wealth. Suetonius claimed that Caesar had assets worth 1 billion sesterces. That would be roughly $28 billion in today's money. On the other hand, Plutarch puts Caesar's wealth at a modest 700 million sesterces, or $20 billion. But according to another historian, Appian, Caesar had an astronomical 1.5 trillion sesterces, or $42 billion. And of course, Octavius got all of those riches when he inherited his will. But that was just the beginning of his fortune. After seizing power in Rome, Octavius wasted no time in consolidating his position, and one of the first things he did was to establish the Julio-Claudian dynasty, which would rule over Rome for the next 2 centuries. As a reward for his loyalty and service, Octavius gave himself the title of Augustus, meaning venerable or impressive, and moved into the luxurious Palatine Hill Palace. He ruled like a god over his people and the entire Mediterranean, and he held this position until his death in AD 14. During his reign, Augustus maintained peace throughout the empire and encouraged the arts and literature. Under his rule, Rome became the cultural capital of the known world. To make his rule more acceptable to the people, he claimed that he wasn't a king or even emperor, but merely the first citizen of Rome. But back to his staggering wealth. In addition to all of Caesar's treasure, Augustus got around 1.6 billion sesterces from Cleopatra, the last active ruler of the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt after her death in 30 BC. After defeating his enemies at the Battle of Actium, he confiscated all of her property and made himself the richest man in the world. During his reign, Augustus greatly expanded the empire and its economy. He conquered new territories, exploited their natural resources, and established new trade routes. He actively promoted trade and industry and introduced a standardized system of weights and measures. Augustus was also a shrewd investor who knew how to turn a profit. For example, he built hotels and leased them to merchants and sailors passing through Rome. He also built public baths, theaters, and other buildings which he rented out for special occasions. One of the most important things that helped him increase his wealth was the introduction of the Roman denarius, a silver coin minted during the Republic in 400 BC. It quickly became one of the most widely used currencies in the ancient world and was used as far away as India and China. It's estimated that around 30 million Roman denarii were minted during Augustus's reign, which means that every year around 600,000 of these coins entered circulation. Given that each denarius weighed half a pound of silver, it's safe to say that Augustus had an insane amount of silver on hand. Another source of income for Augustus was the tribute that the kings of Arabia paid him. Every year they gave him around 300 kilograms of gold, which is worth about $10 million today. This gold came from the Nabatean kingdom of Arabia, Petra, which controlled the trade routes between Egypt and Syria. But even with all this money coming in, Augustus still had expenses. He had to maintain a large army to protect his vast empire. He also had to pay for the upkeep of roads, aqueducts, public buildings, and other infrastructure. Augustus also lavished gifts on his friends and family and on the Roman people. He hosted lavish feasts and games in the Romang Forum and the Circus Maximus, where he gave away free food, wine, and entertainment. He also built parks and gardens and funded public works projects to keep the unemployed citizens busy. Augustus was also generous to the arts and sciences. He founded the Museum of Art and the Library of Alexandria, which became centers of learning and culture. He also sponsored poets, painters, and sculptors and commissioned works of art to adorn public buildings and private homes. Despite all these expenses, Augustus managed to increase his wealth to an incredible $4.6 trillion in today's money. He died in AD 14, leaving the empire to his stepson, Tiberius. When Augustus died, his wealth was transferred to the imperial treasury and it became the property of the state. Historians believe that at the time, the imperial treasury contained about 800 million sesterces, which is equivalent to about $23 billion today. It's not clear what happened to the rest of Augustus's personal fortune, but it's likely that much of it went to his heirs. His daughter, Julia, received a large dowry when she married the future emperor, Tiberius. His granddaughter, Livia, also received a substantial inheritance when her father, Augustus's grandson, died. As for Mansa Musa, there's really no way to know how much money he had. He was the king of the Mali Empire in West Africa from 1307 to 1337. During his reign, he doubled the size of his empire and increased the wealth of his kingdom tenfold. He was also a great patron of Islam and built mosques, madrasas, and other religious buildings. One of the most famous structures built under Mansa's reign was the Jingareber Mosque in Timbuktu. It was the largest mosque in the world when it was built and could hold up to 40,000 worshippers. However, there are no records or other evidence to support the claim that Mansa's wealth was too great to be counted. This probably comes from the fact that his empire was largely based on gold mining and trade. And gold was considered one of the most valuable commodities in the ancient world. In fact, when Mansa went on a pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, he lavished gold on all passers-by. But even if he gave away a ton of gold, that doesn't mean he was the richest man in history. It just means he was very generous. There are many legends and myths about Mansa and his wealth, but they're not based on historical evidence. For example, one story claims that Mansa went bankrupt after giving away all his gold. But there's no evidence that this ever happened. In fact, the Mali Empire remained wealthy and powerful long after Mansa's death. Another myth is that Mansa was so wealthy he caused an economic crisis in Europe because he flooded the market with gold. Again, there's no evidence to support this claim. In fact, European merchants welcomed the influx of gold from the Mali Empire because it increased their profits. So while Mansa was undoubtedly a wealthy and influential ruler, there's no evidence that he was the richest man in history. In fact, his wealth can be reliably estimated, but it's nowhere near Augustus's fortune. Augustus Caesar remains the richest man in history, at least the one we know about, and his wealth adjusted for inflation is $4.6 trillion. How about that? Thanks for watching.